Hi, I'm Ryan Reagan with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Division of Sport Fish. Today's video we're going to tie a bait fish fly. This fly is a relatively easy fly to use and it's extremely effective in both saltwater and freshwater applications. So we'll get started on the bait fish fly by first showing you the list of materials needed for this fly. Starting with the Icelandic sheep hair or the Icelandic wool, of course this is in white. We're going to be using two different colors of the ice tub shimmer fringe today. This material comes in a variety of colors. For this particular fly, we're going to be using 7mm living eyes. These eyes come in a variety of sizes and variations and with pupils, but for this particular fly, a 7mm living eye is what we're going to be using. This is a size 1 saltwater hook. This fly can be tied on any number of sizes of hooks. If you're going to use this fly in salt water, it's recommended that you use a saltwater hook. However, this fly can be used in freshwater, so if your intent is to use this fly in freshwater, you can use a freshwater style hook or a non-plated hook. For this fly, we're using a white 210 denier thread. It's recommended that you use whatever color you choose. It's a high strength thread. Of course, we've got our scissors here. And the final materials that we're going to need to complete this fly, we'll need some epoxy and we'll need some super glue. The epoxy, this is 5-minute epoxy. You can certainly choose to use the UV epoxy, but for this application I find it's a lot stronger to use the 5-minute epoxy. We're going to get started tying this fly by wrapping a small thread base on the shank of the hook. We're only going to come down about 1/4 to 1/3 of the way down the shank of the hook. You can see I've stopped here. I'm just going to clip my tag end off here, dispose of that. The first material we're going to tie in is going to be the Icelandic wool. I'm going to take a small portion of this, probably about that much. We're going to use a small section of that Icelandic wool, about that thick, and I'm pinching it between my fingers here. We're going to clean this edge up a little bit. I'm going to do that over my trash. With that edge cleaned up, we're going to go ahead and lay this Icelandic wool on the shank of the hook. Now you can see I'm not crowding the eye. However, I'm going to tie this in with a couple of loose wraps and then cinch it down and wrap forward, so that my wraps cover the material, the edge of the material that I just laid down. I'm going to move my thread back to where the material was tied in. Now we've got a lot of excess material. We're going to take care of that in a minute. Now I want to move forward slightly by about halfway. You can see there's a halfway point between where the thread ends up toward the eye of the hook and where the thread ends here, just where it's adjacent to that material. We're going to stop there. We're going to cut another small section of wool out, about the same size as we did before. Again, there's that small section that I've used. I'm going to go ahead and take care of the ends there. What we've got here looks like this. Now with this one, this section actually goes on the bottom side of the hook shank. There's a couple ways you can get that in there. If you've got a rotary vise, you can simply turn that over and lock it in. I'm just going to finesse this using my thumb and forefinger here, so you can kind of see, clear some materials out there. I've got a section here that looks like that. I'm going to come in with a couple of loose wraps and I'm going to tighten that down. Now when doing that, I'm going to go ahead and maneuver that material because we want it on the underside of the hook. Now I'll come in here and kind of spread this material out over the point of the hook and simply pull all that material back. If you have excess material that comes out as you pull this off, just simply dispose of it, or just simply dispose of it in the trash. And I'm going to go ahead and finish this by tightening all that down. You can see I've got a nice space here where I'm going to continue wrapping in my materials. The next material we're going to use is going to be the first color of our iStub shimmer fringe. This happens to be chartreuse and white. Again, this comes in a variety of colors, and you're welcome to express your own creativity in deciding what color combinations you're going to use. I'm going to take a small section of this material. I'll lay that here on the hook. You can see I've got a small section. Some of that section is white, some of it is chartreuse. I'm going to clean this end up just a little bit here by simply clipping that material off and letting the rest of it fall away. Now I'm going to begin my wraps just with loose wraps, and I'm going to come in there, I'm going to pinch that material down, and I'm going to go ahead and give it some nice tight wraps, securing that material in. Once the material has been secured in, I'm simply just going to use my left hand and clear out some of that excess material. So you can see the formation that this baitfish pattern is going to take. Now I'm going to come up here, wrap forward on that material a little bit. I'm going to stop again about halfway between where the thread meets the eye of the hook and where the thread ends where the material is. At this point, we're going to go back to our wool, and we're going to cut a small piece off. Hold that up here to show you. We're not going to take as much as we did before to build the back portion of the fly. This is actually just about half of that. You can see there a half to 2/3 anyway of the material we use to tie the back portion of the fly. Now you can see here I've got this small section here. Now again, I'm not going to tie it on the top of the shank of the hook. I'm going to come and tie it underneath. And the trick I'm going to do with this is I'm actually going to take this section of wool and cut it in about half using my eye, just eyeballing that material. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to put that material, just lay it down nice and easy right there, and I'm going to begin with a few loose wraps, and then I'm going to follow those loose wraps up with some tighter wraps. Now what I want to do is I want to make sure that the material spreads evenly over the point of the hook as well as on the front. And if your material moves a little bit, you can always just readjust that with a couple of nice tight wraps. I'm wrapping backwards at this point, back toward where the thread meets the material. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to ultimately wrap this down. My trick here is to pull my thread up and take my left hand and run that material under the hook. Y'all can see how I did that. I'm going to go ahead and start with some loose wraps here where it catches that material, and I'm going to wrap that in. Now again, you're going to have some excess material that here under the base of the hook here, which we're going to take care of momentarily. At this point, I'm going to wrap forward slightly, and I'm going to start building more toward that eye of the hook. You can see I'm slightly building up a thread base right there. Now I'm going to leave this edge exposed, and that's intentional. We're going to talk about that in just a second. The next material we're going to tie in is our darker color shimmer fringe. Okay, this happens to be pearl black or black pearl, and we're going to take a larger section than the chartreuse section here. We're going to take a larger section of this, we're going to cut it off, we're going to tie it in. Okay, I've cleaned up that leading edge, and I'm not going to allow that edge to crowd the eye of my hook. I don't really want any more of that excess material to end up crowding the eye of the hook. I'm simply going to come in here with a couple of loose wraps, and I'm going to pinch that stuff so it doesn't really move, and I'm just going to wrap on down. Okay, continuing on with loose wraps. If you get some excess material in there, just pause, back wrap, and we're going to just keep going forward until we've reached the eye of the hook. We're going to go ahead and wrap this in nice and tight. This is going to be basically the nose of your fly. You want to just make sure you wrap and cover all that excess material. So at this point, we're nearing completion of this fly. What we're going to do now is we're going to whip finish the head of this fly. I've got my whip finisher here. This is a relatively simple tool to use. And if you're unfamiliar with how to use this whip finisher, there are several different types of videos on YouTube which you can watch to learn how to use this. Once we've added a couple whip finishes to that, we're going to go ahead and clip the thread, and this part of the fly is complete. The next material we're going to add are 2 of these living eyes. We're going to add one here and then one on the other side of the hook. Now, the reason we left that exposed thread there, you can see I've left it exposed on either side, is we're going to put a dab of super glue on either side prior to us putting in the living eye. So I'll grab my super glue. I'm going to start over here, put a small dab of super glue there. Okay, one there, and one there. All right, super glue dries fairly quickly, so we want to make sure we're working quickly. Now these eyes, you can see the pupil formation is in a relatively teardrop shape. I'm going to take that teardrop section and move that more toward the back. I'm going to add my eye there. You can also use a bodkin to add your eyes. I'm going to use the butt end of my whip finish tool to slightly press that down. And I'm kind of working quickly here because I don't want this glue to dry up on me. Same thing on the opposite side here. Just putting that eye in place, adjusting it to where I'm happy with it. If it goes in and sets down, you can kind of just maneuver it a little bit. If it falls off, you can pick it up and do it again. I'm just going to get that eye in there where it's relatively close in proximity to the other one. That looks fairly good right now. I'm going to give the super glue a short minute to dry, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to mix up my 5-minute epoxy. I'm just going to put a small dab of epoxy in the center of the bag here, and I'm going to cap my epoxy so it doesn't get all over the place. And I'm going to take the end of my toothpick and simply just mix that 2-part epoxy together. Again, we're using 5-minute epoxy, so the work time with it is relatively short. However, it's long enough where you can get a nice solid head on this fly. Once the epoxy's been mixed up, I simply take a small dab, about that size, maybe a little bit bigger, on my toothpick. I'll just twist it in my hands a little bit, and I'll start adding it to the fly. So before we add the epoxy, we're just going to simply take our thumb and forefinger and move this material back. Again, I want to point out that we do intentionally have excess material coming off of this. We're going to take that in a minute. When I apply this 5-minute epoxy, I do use a toothpick. You can use whatever kind of tool you want. I'm going to come in here and lightly lay that drop down. What I'm going for here is the intent is to cover the eyes to secure them in. Again, we use super glue to lock them into place. However, without the use of the epoxy covering those eyes, over time, those eyes will likely come off. So use as much epoxy or as little epoxy as you want. Remember, you can always add more. It's tough to take this epoxy away, so I always kind of go conservative. And you can see I am turning my vise. This is a rotary vise. If you get material that pokes through the epoxy, don't sweat too much. You can always come in there and clean it out. As you're going along, again, that epoxy is going to drip. You want more epoxy on the top of the fly. When I say top, I mean right here on the top. And what I like to do is I like to come in here and take my toothpick and kind of make sure that the epoxy covers that. So given the fact that it goes over and touches that wool, that's actually our intent here, because we want to make sure that those eyes get covered with the epoxy. Make sure you cover your thread. Now don't try not to get that epoxy to go through the eye of the hook. We don't want that. So if that happens, take your toothpick and just pop it through. And we're just continually turning this. What I like to do here is I like to take a little stripe and kind of run it down the back. All right. So you can see here I've got a slight head on that. That's looking pretty good to me. I see an eye. You can see in here there's a section where it looks like that epoxy hasn't quite gone right into the eye, so I'm adding just a touch more. And again, when working with epoxy, you don't want to put too terribly much on to begin with. Like I said, you can always add more. It's really tough to take this epoxy away. Now, what I like to do is I like to come in here and kind of add a little bit of an epoxy back there. I don't mind getting a little bit of epoxy on my fingers. If you do, then you can potentially put on some latex gloves. Now, this epoxy, once it begins to set up, you lose your work time. So like I said, the main thing is here with epoxy, you want to make sure those eyes are locked in. Because over time and over fish, you want to make sure this endures. So it's looking pretty good to me. And as I use this vise to turn around, I can help maneuver that epoxy as it's moving, making its way into all those crevices that I want it in. If you get a little too much on the top, just feel free to spread a little back. And ultimately, you're looking for a head that looks similar to what we have here. Now again, if you've got epoxy dripping off, probably used a little bit too much, that's okay. You can always take some away by using a brush or something like that, but this guy here, we can already see the epoxy starting to slightly set up. I like it. I've got my thread covered. I've got what looks to be a fairly solid head on this fly. Now, as I said, this is 5-minute epoxy. It does take about that much time to set up, and what I'm going to do during that time frame is I'm going to sit here and just kind of keep slowly rotating that fly. If you do not have a rotary vise, that's okay. You can devise something, a little device that will help you spin this fly. I've made them myself, basically using just a piece of PVC pipe and some pipe insulation. And they work really well. I know that some folks might not be wanting to use the 5-minute epoxy because there is the time that it does take to set up, but I can assure you that for strength and durability, this stuff can't be beat. Again, I'm just coming in here and touching up areas where I think we need just a touch more epoxy. And she's about set up and ready to go, so I'm going to quit messing around with it. Just keep spinning my fly pattern. And we'll see in a couple minutes once this head is dry, and I'll show you how to trim this fly up so we get a better bait fish profile on this fly. It's been 5 or so minutes here. I think our epoxy's set up relatively well. I usually let these guys sit for a couple hours before putting them in my fly box, but what we're going to do at this point is we're going to go ahead and start trimming off this excess material, and I'm going to just simply release the fly from the vise, and I'm going to, for demonstration purposes here, what I would normally do is hold this over a trash can and trim this material away. So I'm trying to just maneuver that material around the point of the hook because I'm going to reinsert it into the vise. So what I've done is basically just taken all of that material and exposed the bend and the barb of the hook. So you can kind of see that there. Now what I'm going to do now is just simply put that back into my vise, clamp the vise down, and then continue to move all that back, okay? When you trim this, you want to consider the profile of the bait fish, and you want to leave enough body material that hangs down from the eye of the hook down to the point of the hook. You want to consider your material, you want to kind of lay it in an angle like that goes basically from the point of your hook up to the eye of the hook. So you can see my scissors here make that slight angle. And if you need to pull some material down, again, I would normally do this over a trash can, but you can see I'm using the point of the hook as a guide in relation to the eye of the hook. You can see how I position my scissors there, and I'm going to make my cut right there. So again, I've taken off just a little bit of material. When you trim this fly, keep in mind that it's a lot like epoxy. Don't put on too much, don't take off too much. You can always go back and take off a little bit more. So go slow. If this is your first time doing it, just kind of go slow. Now I'll point out the back section here. You can see I've got some material right here that kind of follows the shape of the bait fish. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and keep using the end of the what would be the top of the tail over here. I'm going to imagine a sort of half moon or crescent moon shape here, and I'm just going to simply go in there and cut that excess material away, edging my scissors up toward the tail of the hook. And once I've got all that stuff out, I'll just move it, throw it in my trash can here, or if you save your materials, and wherever location you save that material. Now I've got a couple of strands hanging off here on my tail. I'm actually going to come in from the top now, and I'm going to angle my scissors only slightly. I'm not going in too deep. I'm going in like this, okay? And I'm just going to simply cut a couple strands off here, a couple strands off there. And I'm going to come in here, even everything up. I'm going to spin this over to make sure I don't have anything excess on the other side. Clean that material away. Gently come in there, move that material back, see if we've got any stragglers. Looks like we might have a few. Take care of them. Again, just take your time. You're not in any rush. You just want to make your profile look like a nice bait fish. And again, if you want to do this in your vise, you certainly can. Like I said, I typically take it out and do this, but for this video, I'm leaving it in. After I've decided that I've cut off enough of that material, I just move it back a little bit, see if we got anything that's poking out. If we do, take care of it. And that looks like your bait fish fly is complete. This is your completed bait fish fly. Again, you can use different types of colors for this particular fly. You can also use different types of materials for the body. Like I said, we use the Icelandic sheep hair here or Icelandic wool. I've also used white craft fur. It basically is the same process to tie the fly. So just follow the steps and you should be fine with whatever material you so choose for that body. In terms of the shimmer fringe, again, it's up to you. You can use as much or as little as you want, depending upon the size of the hook you're tying this fly on. Again, this is a size 1 saltwater hook. If you go bigger, you might want to consider finding those larger eyes. Again, we're using 7mm eyes here. The main thing is that 5-minute epoxy is certainly my recommendation. You can certainly use UV epoxy if you want. Again, my opinion, that 5-minute epoxy is worth the time that it takes to wait to set up for it in terms of the overall durability of the fly. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you on the water. Have fun fishing.